welcome to another episode of Shed Manufacturing. Today we'll be doing something else that isn't the Project Lincoln. We'll be getting into a little bit of suspension rebuild on this Porsche 930 Turbo, which is sort of a 934 replica. But anyway, we'll be replacing the standard rubber type bushings in the front suspension for these monobore units, and the same thing with the rears. These should be a fairly simple drop-in. These bushings go on over the sleeve, and then the monoballs go on top. And then we'll also be getting into sway bar bushings for the front and sway bar bushings for the rear. Hopefully this should tighten this car up and make it a little more predictable and a little easier to handle, especially with the wide tires that it's running and the low offsets. Well, I've already pulled the wheels off, and we can sort of get right into it. So all Porsche suspension design is kind of weird. It utilizes a torsion bar or torsion springs, and it's housed within the lower control arm itself, and they are keyed and tied together with the reaction plate that doubles as the steering rack subframe. It's odd to lift a car and not see any springs, but the design has some pretty serious benefits. It keeps the weight about as low as possible and further inboard. Height tuning is easily achieved with adjustable screws and the reaction plate, and the forces hold the car up are fed through the reaction plate at the bottom of the car, meaning less chassis deflection and less reinforcement needed. Pulling the bushings has to be a more delicate job than it typically is because the spring is housed within the control arm, so you don't want to put too much heat into the bushing for fear of taking the temper out of the spring steel. So it's just more work for me. And yes, you typically can pull the springs out of the bottom of the control arm, but in this case the spring was pretty stuck in there, and to me it wasn't worth potentially damaging the knurling on the car side, on the chassis side of the spring, in order to get it out, when I could just put limited amounts of heat into the bushing and try and keep it towards the edge. And so here you go, just getting to watch me struggle as the bushings fight me the whole time. Then we get up to the arbor press and get it set up to press out the old sway bar bushings, and this tool has proven itself to be extremely useful. It has a much larger throw and is much quicker to operate than a bench vise, and although it doesn't have the power of a 20-ton hydraulic press that we have in the shop, its speed far outweighs the disadvantages for it. Plus, most of the time you don't really need all 20 tons. And here we just sort of rinse and repeat for the other side. A little more heat and just more sweat and toil and pulling. Then we got to clean up the ends to get all of the old rubber debris and really any old grime and paint off there, because we will be putting epoxy to hold those new bearing cup sleeves on. So those are machined to a very tight tolerance from Elephant Racing. So once we get those all cleaned up, we'll put the epoxy, get it all mixed up, and get those squished on there. If I was to do this again, I would have mixed the epoxy in two smaller groups instead of one big batch and trying to go for one, because I didn't really read the package when I got the epoxy in, and it turns out that it was the fast setting stuff, so I only had about 6 minutes to really do what I'm supposed to be doing here. And on number 4, you'll probably see me really squish here. I wound up having to squeeze it with a piece of wood to get it all the way seated. Now the instructions for the rears are actually pretty funny. Step 1, they say remove trailing arm, which, you know, sounds pretty simple, except removing the trailing arm includes pulling the wheel, the brake rotor, the handbrake cable, the shock, and I think a couple other bits and pieces, but it's a much more involved job than just pull the trailing arm. But here we are, we got it done. The previous owner seemed to have coated it in some sort of goo, so that got absolutely everywhere, and I did did my best to clean some of that off a little later on. So foolishly, I took apart the rear torsion bar, which turns out isn't necessary to remove the rear trailing arms on these. So when I went to reset it to its factory place, or to the position where it was set from the previous, I went ahead and got my laser level out, referenced it from the other one where it sat, and then clocked it appropriately, and it set back down perfectly fine. So here we have to hammer out the old steel cups from the rather soft aluminium trailing arm. So you have to be very careful and do that by hand. You don't really want to put any air hammers on that because you will kill them. So with this, I had to press the new monoball units in, and it was a pretty tight fit. This was made easier with the use of a heat gun on the suspension arm, and it swelled the suspension arm quite a bit and just added just that little bit of clearance I needed to get it slid in. Otherwise, I think you'd gall the surfaces pretty badly. Here I am enlisting Perry as a helping hand to hold it. So the advantages of the monoballs is they do not deflect, and they keep a nice consistent geometry point throughout the swing of the rear trailing arm. So when you have thicker tires and more power going through it, the rubber in traditional bushings tends to deflect and actually change the alignment based on power load and also cornering load. The monoballs, although a little less comfortable for daily use, eliminate that flex. They give the car a more direct and a more predictable way of cornering and handling. So for a car like this that's pretty wild and pretty fun looking and has some upgrades to it, this very obviously isn't a daily driver, and the owner wanted some really nice feeling suspension. Right then, before we proceed any further, let's have a quick chat. So we got all of the new suspension components installed in the Porsche. That's the monoball bushings at the rear and the swivel type monoball bushings that we installed in the front control arms as well. Got all of that squared away, and installation was the exact opposite of pulling it apart, only I had to do a bit more cleaning. So before I pulled this into the shop, I noticed that the whole car was sitting a little bit low on the passenger side. And Porsches, because of their design, have torsion bars, not traditional springs. And they have keys with adjusters on them. So what we can actually do is, by adjusting the screws on the keys or adjusting the keys in position on the splines on the torsion bars themselves, we can adjust ride height somewhat infinitely. I mean, obviously within some parameters, but what we're going to do to determine that the ride height is where we want it, and also determine that we're not cross-jacking the car by having, say, this front wheel and the passenger side rear wheel bear most of the weight. I'm going to get the scales out. We're going to put the scales on these big box cribs. Before we set the car on the box cribs, I'll get a laser level out and make sure all the box cribs are level to each other, front and rear. So that way we have a nice, level, stable platform to lower the car onto. We'll then be able to take readings on the pressures of each wheel on the scales, cross-jack the car appropriately to get those all evened out the best we can. Because this isn't a motorsports application, although it does look very motorsports inspired, I'm not going to bother putting a 200-pound sack of potatoes in the driver's seat. And I think it's got right at a half tank of fuel, so that's sort of perfect for what we're doing for that. As these are rear engine and front fuel tank, I have heard that the amount of fuel in these does affect handling to some degree. Anyway, I'll get the scales out, we'll get this cross-jacked, we will set ride height to where we want it. I really liked the height that the driver's side was on. The passenger side was just a little bit too low, and although this would look cool, just absolutely scraping the cat's eyes off the road, I think it's better if we have a more responsible ride height with it. So we'll do that, and then I might set up a string box and try and align the rears, because when you pull the rear control arms, the rear trailing arms off of these, you wind up having to completely throw all of your alignment specs out of the way. Well, I won't hold you up any longer. Let's get into it. Well, that's actually quite light. I mustn't tell him, he'll be insufferable.